G'day mates, Nate the Aussie here. So, if you are a part of the martial arts community and you have not at least heard of at least some kind of rumour or heard directly about either of these videos made either by Skallagrim or by Shadiversity or by Scholagladiatoria, also known as Matt Easton, if you haven't heard of any of these yet, you probably have missed out on a lot and could possibly be living under a rock as well. Either way, I do recommend watching these videos because it poses a very interesting question when looking at historical martial arts in general. Now, I don't think this debate is new. I don't think this is the very first time these thoughts have been aired. I just think that someone has made a public video on this, someone who has a decent following, and that, of course, has brought a lot of these thoughts to the fore. And sort of to contribute to this, I would like to add sort of my 2 cents on this as well. Now, I can't give as much background to HEMA as, say, for example, Scholagladiatoria does, because his background in HEMA is obviously much more advanced than mine. However, I still feel that I have a background that can contribute to this discussion, so I am here to just share my own thoughts, and you can take from this what you will. Now, I think it is important to mention here that I am not necessarily fully agreeing or fully disagreeing with either what Matt Easton has said from Scholagladiatoria or what Shadiversity has said. I believe both are mentioning valid points, but I also feel there are some contexts that are important to mention here. Now, Shadiversity talks about this idea of having multiple methods of historical study that not just include manuals and treatises and codexes or fact books, but also other aspects as well. And he uses archaeology as an example. Now, this is correct and also incorrect, and I'm saying this from a historical study perspective. Something that needs to be said here is that while archaeology deals with history, it is not the same thing as being an historian. So basically, history and archaeology qualifications are different things, particularly when it comes to practical knowledge. Just because archaeology deals with historical items does not mean that they are historians, and just because a historian conducts historical study on certain time periods does not make them an archaeologist. Different sources will tell you different things. No sources can tell you every single thing about something. This is where the experimentation and the accepting or utilization of various forms of sources can be useful. However, one should not use an illustration of artists who has no combat or training experience in the same way as one uses a manual that is written by someone who does. An individual's background, as well as the source itself, will determine what it can tell you. Now, should one only use treatises, or only use forensic studies of weapons or mass battle graves? Neither. Well, ideally, one should be using both. Only using one of them would be like trying to complete a puzzle by only using the corners. And this connects to Shadiversity's argument where he says that a sword itself is a source when you're actually trying to figure out how the weapon was used. Now, is a sword a source? Well, potentially, depending on what you want to learn. It does hold relevance to the study of martial arts, just as much as a katana, uchikatana, or tachi is referencing and a source to kenjutsu. One way, for example, a weapon can give you clues as to how it was used are certain marks on the weapon, and seeing if that holds up and shares sort of consistency and similarities with other forms of that weapon as well. Otake sensei from Katori Shinto Ryu uses this example when he's talking about many katana from the Warring States period, where you can see many marks that match parrying marks on the back of the blade. However, saying that a sword tells you everything there is to know about how to use it is then like saying that holding a scalpel and looking at it will tell you everything there is to know about using it to perform a surgery.
That's how I lost my medical license.
What? I'm not quite sure if this is what Shad is saying actually, however. And, well, at least from my perspective, it seems that a lot of people are making very straw man or weak versions of Shad's arguments, including Matt Easton's arguments as well, to then try and make a point, which I don't think is very fair to either individual. In terms of Shad, it seems that he is saying that while the manuals are extremely useful and we should always refer to them, that we should not be only restricted by the manuals. Now, if he is saying that as well as a collection of different sources, including the manual, should be used, then I agree with that sentiment. Now, the debate on what is history or what is historical is extremely old and is affected by numerous methods of thinking and worldviews such as empiricism and skepticism. Trying to use history as being something purely connected with written record in the way that Matt Easton is saying is problematic, and trying to use it purely by Homo sapiens sapien development is even harder. A common misconception when looking at texts is just thinking that texts are purely written things. What? The study of literature will actually show that a text is not just something written, a text is something that communicates meaning to someone, which can literally be anything from a painting all the way through to someone speaking about something. It is not just purely something written down. The reason why history is so problematic is that it is always by interpretation and perspective. For example, we think we are the current day and everything before us was the past. However, I would also say that the Romans thought that their day was the current day as well. The Greeks also thought they were pretty modern at the time as well. Past, future, and present are always evolving based on the current individual's perspective. Because it was down so much to perspective, movements like public history appeared, defining history as everything and something that is inherently human simply because it is us either living it and interpreting it. There is actually a quote by UK historian Ian Mortimer who says that the way we learn about history is, yes, through ruins and archives, but the means whereby we understand it is, and always will be, ourselves. Early aspects of public history are things such as museums, and later forms of it are experimental archaeology and living history and reenactment and these kinds of things. Now, Shadiversity's take on experimental archaeology is only partly correct. There is a lot more to it than just experimenting. There is a lot more study and thought that goes behind it. Now, those martial artists who are not historians sometimes believe that what they are doing is different to standard historical study. However, I find this is based on very little actual academic evidence. Historical martial arts are, by definition, within the area of historical study. Historical martial arts are just a part of history, as the Bayeux Tapestry, the Roman baths throughout Europe, the pyramids, and the Great Wall of China. Now, I am not saying that historical European martial arts is an ancient relic, purely on its own, such as, for example, a Great Wall of China is, but I'm saying that it is just as much as part of historical study as it would be to study the Great Wall of China. This is why historical European martial arts, historical Japanese martial arts, and historical African martial arts, etc., these practitioners cannot claim that what they are doing is not a form of historical study. This does not, however, make them historians, as well as it doesn't make historians historical martial artists, and this difference is crucial. Archaeology and historical martial arts deal with historical items or concepts such as weapon treatises, artifacts, etc., but we do not call these people historians, nor vice versa, such as historians being called archaeologists, etc. Dealing with the same concept or field does not create the same job or qualification. Only at best it might create similar knowledge in certain areas. For example, a nurse is not a doctor is not a surgeon, a psychologist is not a psychiatrist, and a helicopter pilot isn't a jet pilot, and so on. One can use some information of one of them to come to know or understand the other, but it doesn't make one have perfect knowledge of both fields. This works the same for history enthusiasts and historical martial arts practitioners. Both areas can use combat treatises. Both can research a specific time period, but being a history enthusiast does not make you an historical martial arts practitioner or vice versa, unless, of course, one happens to be both. Just as much as being someone who likes to experiment and test with their katana does not make one a formal student of kenjutsu unless one actually is. They may come to similar conclusions, of course, simply because there are only so many ways to use a sword in an alleyway or open field or grappling context, etc. However, they are still not the same thing. This is why, in my opinion, it is much better if these people work together rather than simply belittle each other and keep saying that the other person is wrong. There is truth outside of the manuals, but there is also truth within the manuals, and historical enthusiasts should continue their study of both manuals and also other sources. Both should work together, using their own relevant backgrounds, not using their backgrounds, or lack of which, to belittle each other. Because being an elitist on either side of the spectrum, and saying that the other is wrong just because they are who they are, does not help anyone go forward, it does not promote any kind of progressive nature, and just keeps the bickering and development becomes stagnant and doesn't move anywhere. If living historians, for example, worked with museum professionals and also vice versa, the progression that could be made is mind-boggling to behold. It would be awesome. It is the exact same here with the study of martial arts. Both sides acknowledge that they're different, but also both sides should also acknowledge that they can work together from their own respective backgrounds and knowledge. Therefore, should experimentation purely on its own be labelled as HEMA? I don't believe so. However, does this mean that HEMA is the only practice that creates any valid conclusions on how the weapon was used in its context? I personally don't think so, purely based on the universal rules of combat and what works. One may even discover, for oneself, a technique that is used in a historical European martial arts or Japanese martial arts or African martial arts, etc. school through experimentation and or sparring, etc. However, this does not make one a member of a specific HEMA school or system. I think the key here is to remember that, while being an enthusiast and a member of a club are not the same thing, we should not think that only one of them can create any form of valid conclusion, because that itself is the very elitism that Skallagrim and Shad address, and that Matt Easton seems to deny the existence of.